Welcome, everyone. Just to let you know, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the talk. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And yeah, enjoy the talk.
Hi. The name of my talk is Understanding and Visualizing Dependencies Between Notebook Cells. My name is Colin Brown. I'm a PhD student at Northern Illinois University back in the US. I'm a contributor to dataflow notebooks. My research interests are in reproducibility. I'm really interested in assessing and aiding in notebook reproducibility specifically. Notebooks suck at reproducibility. Many groups have examined and just how poorly they reproduce, and quite frankly, it's been talked to death at this point, with rates varying from as low as 4% to up to 27%. One way to view reproducibility is as the problem of dumping everything into an isolated Jupyter environment and just trying to rerun it and hope you get the same results. We're really not interested in that facet, though. We're interested in how understanding notebooks can instead improve reproducibility. There are a million different ways to show how notebooks fail to reproduce, and you'll never give the same results. My personal favorite is Monte Carlo simulation for finding pi. If you don't have enough points, it'll never converge, so you'll always get a different result in the notebook. And we want to understand why that will never reproduce because we understand this notebook. And so how do notebooks fail when we don't really understand them? So we have a notebook here that's been previously run that we don't really understand how we got here. Can't a run all just fix everything? No, it's not really all that simple. Though it's a nice thought, it's not really a solution to the problem. And so there's been a lot of desire for reactive notebooks. Going back as far as 2013, it was discussed in the IPython dev mail list. And then that spilled over into GitHub. And then that went into the discourse. Multiple times it's come up as a topic of discussion that's never really been resolved. It's not a major feature of Jupyter notebooks, but it's been encouraged by the community. So there are many reproducible or reactive kernels out there. Just to throw a few out there, I think everyone knows IPyFlow at this point. They gave a presentation yesterday. It was worth a watch. David Brocard developed an asynchronous Jupyter kernel as well. And Hex, a private company, has also been getting attention lately. And of course, Pluto, who just gave a presentation earlier, also uses a form of reactivity as well. So it's clear there's a number of good solutions out there, and a few others have kind of fallen by the wayside over the years. So, but we know we're not the only ones in town. And so we can also look at what others are doing in the broader community. Observable exclusively uses the idea of keeping a dataflow notebook structure present throughout the entire notebook. They take this structure and rerun everything in topological order every time something has changed. There's some distinct advantages in this type of approach, but also some clear downsides with the need to re-execute everything every time something has changed, including long-running cells. And so since I've talked a little bit about other kernels, it's a good idea to talk a little bit about who we are. Dataflow Notebooks was originally a notebook infrastructure that we created for use with Jupyter notebooks. We previously attended JupyterCon in 2018, where we mostly focused on just the notebook. But now we're in the future, so we're focusing on the lab now, just like everyone else should really be doing at this point. So we use a directed acyclic graph framework to match what's going on in the notebook, and then we pass this DAG back across the channel. So this means that we can tie the cells in the notebook directly to what exists in the Python side. And this allows us to do kind of fun things like maintain tags in the metadata of the notebook that allow us to know which cells contain which variables when we want to look at old notebooks. Dataflow notebooks behave very similarly to reactive programming languages. We'll introduce some additional terminology for the sake of a little bit of simplicity. Upstream and downstream. A data flow is a stream, and data flows downstream, much like a directed acyclic graph. Variables update as changes occur. If a variable upstream is changed, then the downstream will rerun the code that was executed upstream. Every time we update the notebook, we push across the changes that are made in the underlying graph structure. This means that we have a Python kernel that maintains the references as they are passed into the notebook. We also prevent out-of-order executions from happening as we know what the upstreams of cells are from the directed acyclic graph. However, there are some pitfalls of reactive frameworks. Every architecture seems to have its own problems and, unique inner workings. So very few have focused on making sure that the notebook itself is still going to be reproducible at the end of the day in a new session. Though many have made rules that kind of aid in making that happen. Although we can't speak for solutions like Hex, since Hex is a private company, others in the community have expressed that it's a static analysis, which also comes with its own set of issues. But ultimately, we should be focusing on being an open source community anyways and use open source solutions. Another example of kind of these rules that are made to make notebooks more reproducible is Notebook, who basically enforces this top-down ordering to ensure that everything re-executes properly. So solutions are great, but IPyFlow, Observable, and our approach, Dataflow notebooks, all do what they're supposed to do. That's great. But how do we actually know what's going on in the notebook? You might come back to a notebook a year later, or a day later, or even a few hours later, and you don't know which variables connect to what. If I make changes to one cell, what's going to be impacted? Maybe we don't even want to re-execute some parts of the notebook that run long. How are we going to know if we actually need to execute a cell without doing some static analysis in our head ourselves? So this is kind of a little bit of a teaser about where we're going. So now that we've covered enough ground to talk about how we actually got here, let's talk a little bit about visualization. We maintain a directed acyclic graph in our notebooks, so we should be able to use any technique that takes advantage of that. So where should we start? An obvious place to start, node link diagrams. The standard approach has been just to use node link diagrams. It's been a standard approach for data flows and for workflows for a very long time. So long, in fact, that GraphViz was released 32 years ago at this point. And it's really just become a go-to for directed acyclic graph visualizations. The high exportability of the graphs, and the ease of making changes to the underlying dot language, including the number of shapes that you can choose, has made it very popular. But how do node link diagrams actually look in practice? The structure of the node link diagram can be very simple. It's a node and a link. In essence, we have an object that depends on another object. This is slightly more complicated when we add the notebook into the picture, as each cell in the notebook can have multiple outputs. Our solution is to treat every notebook cell as a cluster in the digraph. This can be very simple if we choose not to display cells that are final outputs and just serve as output markers, and it leads to a lot less clutter. And so it becomes important to actually look at what an update to the notebook looks like in node link diagram. Updates require recomputing the layout every single time we add a new cell to the graph or change a dependency relationship. There's very little way to know ahead of time what the best way to lay out the SVG is. This means we have to constantly adjust how zoomed in we are every time we introduce another layer. This can also lead to some interesting behavior when we have drastic changes in the layout of the node link diagram, but not in the content of the notebook. So, are there some other approaches? There are very few ways to really approach visualizing a DAG in a way that's innately understandable in the notebook context. You could use something like an adjacency matrix, but that's kind of silly. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. If you really want to confuse someone, yeah, it's a good choice. And it's very space constrained. So the academic space doesn't have much we can learn from. But how about outside of academia? It's always good to take inspiration from other notebooks, and the minimap created by Observable seems like a good place to start. Much like the other approaches to this problem, the minimap is still a node link diagram, but it's a custom version of a node link diagram. Instead of having everything displayed at once, we can look at only what we're interested in instead. A cell is represented by a singular point in a y-coordinate plane and shows trails that lead off to the left if the cell refers to something, or to the right if the cell is referenced by something else. Cells can have both trails on both sides as well, which means that it's referenced and references something. And a singular point in the overview means that a cell isn't connected to anything else, and you're free to delete it without impacting anything else in the notebook. In addition to the overview, each cell in the notebook has a different view to it. If we click on a cell in the notebook, we move any cells that are related to that cell to the left or right. We move them to the right if they're downstream from the cell that's being referenced, or to the left if they're upstream of our selected nodes. We then draw paths between those nodes based on all the relevant selected nodes. Observable has also made a distinction between immediate dependencies and dependencies that aren't explicit. Paths are only drawn between immediate dependencies, but indirect dependencies still move to the left or right. And in addition, the text is thrown onto the side of the minimap. So how would the minimap actually work in Jupyter? The minimap of a notebook is a set of individual dependency views. Each dependency has a singular view that we can get to by selecting that output. We also choose to identify each. In the selected view, we can see the upstreams and the downstreams of that particular cell. So there's a linear structure to the minimap. And the structure of the minimap is the structure of the notebook. What this means is if we move a cell, we can keep the structure the same. And it makes sense kind of innately since we don't have to try and guess where a dependency in the notebook is. Having a visualization that actually matches what we expect to see in the notebook just kind of makes sense. In addition to understanding the notebook as a singular piece, we also know it's hard to understand the differences between two notebooks and remember everything between them. It may be useful when you have a couple of notebooks that you've recently checked into Git and you don't know the difference between a version on your laptop, or maybe you just need to know which version of an old file you just have lying around. It can be useful to just see your notebooks at a glance and know exactly where the changes are happening. And so let's talk a little bit about the importance of linking visualizations to outputs. Because each cell in the notebook corresponds to a node in the notebook, we feel it's important to convey what each point actually means. As we navigate through the notebook, we can see that our minimap updates as we browse. This type of integration encourages users to actually be looking at what they're working on and how it impacts things around it. And although we intend to continue working on both the node link diagram and the minimap in our work, it's important that we also talk about why the minimap or the node link diagram works better and what scenarios you might find yourself preferring one or the other. We want this space to become larger, as visualization is an important part of understanding, and we don't want any of these approaches to be seen as magic or it just works. Developers love to use those phrases, but having interpretable design should be a focus in development and not left by the wayside. So the minimap provides a strong case for itself most of the time, but the node link diagram provides a more helpful overview at a glance. We can see all the cells in the notebook at once. We have the ability to see what cells are important just by glancing at what cells are the highest up. This isn't an exact science because we're at the mercy of a graph layout algorithm, but it mostly does a good job most of the time. If I was given the following diagram on the right, I could tell there are two different groupings in the notebook. One that depends heavily on NumPy, and the other that relies heavily on the random library. I don't get that information as easily in the minimap. I actually have to start going digging. However, messy graphs exist. One of the areas that traditional node link diagrams really suffer at is edge crossings. There's plenty of literature in the graph drawing community about how edge crossings decrease understanding and analysis tasks. Unfortunately, it's hard to fix edge crossings for large graphs as well while maintaining that same layout that closely matches what we would expect to see when we're interested in something like a notebook. And we also have some other issues as well, like the use of space. Unfortunately, node link diagrams tend to take up a lot of space and can be confusing if they don't. We can swap the horizontal and the vertical axis using GraphViz, but this really doesn't solve our problem. It just makes it a lot longer. So let's talk a little bit about updates. Updates are easier to understand in a minimap. I guess this one's not auto-playing. There we go. Updates are way easier to understand in minimap, and this is probably why it's getting so much attention. Since the structure of the notebook is maintained, all we have to do is move things up and down or add something at the end. We also know that these views match what we see in the notebook, but updates become very hard to follow in the node link diagram, because every time there's a new cell added to the graph, the layout has to be recomputed. Thus, there should be a stronger need to see something like the minimap, where these changes are only computed on the y-axis. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about usability. We've found some evidence that the minimap performs either as well or better compared to the standard node link diagrams. We performed an initial user study of these visualizations. We've already conducted. We even believe from a standard standpoint, something that matches what we expect to see in the notebook is just ultimately more natively understandable, and we think it's just kind of a step forward. So kind of looking forward, right now we're still working on releasing this as a beta, and we're looking to ensure that these designs move beyond functional prototype phase. Later this year, actually like a month from now, we'll be also presenting some work related to the usability of these techniques at Hilda, which is an academic workshop in June in Seattle. And so kind of the conclusion of this piece is visualizations are a good step towards understanding notebooks. And when we come back to a notebook weeks or months later, or even when we share our notebooks, this kind of understanding is key. We hope that these techniques can help enable the creation of not just reproducible notebooks, but understandable notebooks. Any questions?
I'll come over here first.
Did you open source or make available your usability research in any way?
As far as the usability...
1 second, remember to repeat the question.
The question was, did we actually make available our usability research? As this is going to be published in a month, we can't make that available until it's through publishing process. What? Yeah, but we plan to, sorry.
Hi, I'm Steven. It's a really, really nice work, amazing, in fact, and I really look forward to reading the Hilda paper. The question I have is, do you plan to expose any APIs for, other extension authors to be able to make visualizations out of the work that you've done?
So right, I have to say the question. So the question was, do we plan to expose any APIs for other extension authors? How we actually kind of develop the packages on the TypeScript, everything is kind of separate, so it's pretty much free to do whatever you want. That was kind of our aim from the start. There's no like API, but yeah. It's pretty much, yeah.
Hey, really nice talk. I work on Pluto.jl, and we've done some similar research and experiments, and I had one really frustrating thing, which is that Observable is a commercial company, and their terms of service say that you're not allowed to copy their style. And for me, that really hindered me from really going into this. And I wonder, are you also bothered by this, or did you deal with this somehow?
So the question was, Observable is a private company. Are we all concerned about potentially violating their designs through copyright? I mean, I built it from the ground up by looking at the designs, not by copying their designs. So I'm not particularly worried about that. It's just a node link diagram at the end of the day. So I don't know how much claim they have to. It would be interesting to see if they sue us.
Hi, sorry. I had a kind of a slightly fundamental question, I guess. So it's not necessarily with the visualization, but kind of under the hood to some degree. So I can totally understand how this can work if you track names in the AST or something like that, but that's very surface level. So usually the code written isn't pure, in a functional programming concept, in terms of there can be side effects. So in one cell you could write to a file, and in another cell you could read from that file, and inherently there's a dependency there, but that's unlikely to be tracked if you're looking at surface level AST style or static analysis style parsing in one way or another. There's a whole branch of work around taint analysis. So where people try to say, if I create an API or something and data comes in from a user, and we want to be sure that doesn't cause, I don't know, some writing to an operating system somewhere or something like that. And you try to basically search through the flow of how data moves through the greater program. But that tends to be inherently probabilistic. The best frameworks are probabilistic, so they make estimates, because it's very hard to actually track unless it's very restricted code in one form or another. So is the goal of this to ensure reproducibility, or is it to be a kind of a crutch in order to help in certain circumstances, but not to try to give a full guarantee that you can actually reproduce one for one, the original processing and data flow of the program?
So the question was, is this kind of a crutch to enabling is this a kind of a good way to explain your question in a more succinct way? Yeah, well, we try and guarantee reproducibility to a certain extent, but there are issues with certain objects. Notebook actually did some more interesting stuff on that end because they would write things directly to memory, which we do not do. It is more reproducible than a standard notebook where you can do all sorts of crazy cyclical stuff, though.
Okay, unfortunately, time's up. So if there are any more questions, please ask the presenter directly, and we'll welcome our next speaker.